Hello, welcome to InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw. April is National Fair Housing Month in honor of the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act to ensure access to housing free of discrimination. 55 years later, how well is it working? What is fair housing? And what does housing discrimination look like? And how do you report illegal housing discrimination? Will you please welcome Marlee Baker and Samuel Goldberg of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Marlee, what are your specialties at the Fair Housing Council?
Absolutely. My name is Marlee. I am the Portland Metro and Education Outreach Specialist. I also cover the city of Salem. So my specialty is I go out into communities, I meet with community members and social service providers and housing providers and talk to them about what is fair housing, what are their rights under fair housing, and what are their responsibilities under fair housing.
Well, thank you for that, Marlee. And Samuel, your specialties.
Yeah, I cover a lot of land use issues. So I cover the whole state. I work with a lot of jurisdictions around what their responsibilities are under the Fair Housing Act and affirmatively furthering fair housing, which we'll get into exactly what that means. But yeah, so I work with a lot of cities and housing advocates across the state on those types of issues.
What can you not do?
Yes, so we cannot provide support related to landlord-tenant law. Issues related to lease agreements, repair, maintenance, evictions, we do not provide emergent services. This means that anyone who may contact us who is facing an immediate eviction, we are going to immediately refer them to the Eviction Defense Project or an alternative agency who's better equipped and prepared to support an individual through that. We also do not provide case management.
Well, thank you. Let's throw this open to both of you right now because there's a little confusion in my mind. Fair housing and the housing crisis. Is there a difference between the two? Give us an idea. How do we sort that out?
I think a lot of individuals often confuse fair housing issues with landlord-tenant issues. Landlord-tenant law usually deals with issues related to maintenance and repairs, lease and rental agreements. Fair housing law can come into play when an individual is being treated differently in any of those housing transactions because of protected class. So fair housing law protects all of us within landlord-tenant law transactions to be treated fairly during any of those.
Yeah, and it's also important to make sure it's distinct from affordable housing, right? We in Oregon know a lot about the affordable housing crisis that has hit us really hard, as well as the houselessness crisis and general problems of underproduction. All of those things are very real issues, but they are ultimately overlapping but distinct from fair housing. So fair housing is about how those resources are able to be accessed. And that they're able to be accessed equally based on your variety of characteristics, but it does not necessarily mean affordable housing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. And let's actually just start with the Fair Housing Act itself. It was a landmark civil rights bill signed into law by President Johnson in 1968. And it was born in a rather turbulent era. Your area of expertise is history. So tell us about it. How did it come about?
Yeah, it did come out of the very turbulent decade of the 60s. It's the capstone to the civil rights era of legislation, right? It's the last one. It was considered the most difficult one to be passed. It was originally going to be part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was also there was an attempt to pass it in 1966 in a bill that ultimately went nowhere. And then it finally got through in 1968. It's considered Title 8 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And it was passed a week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So Martin Luther King is assassinated, riots break out in 125 cities. Clearly something big, some good faith gesture is needed from the government to show that they take the issues of the population seriously, that they're going to do something about it. And so it finally gets through in 1968.
And what was that act? What was
Right.
it designed to do?
Right. So at the time, we were still living under the a very segregated system of neighborhoods, and there was no protections, at least on the federal level, for people to be able to access housing equally based on their what we call protected class characteristics. So in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, it originally said that you could not be discriminated against in any housing transaction on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. So those are the original 4 protected classes. That was expanded to include sex in 1974, which we now consider to also include gender identity and sexual orientation. And then in 1988, it was expanded yet again to cover disability and familial status. So that's, kind of where we are with the overall fair housing protections that are covered under federal law. Now, there's a second piece of that I alluded to earlier, which is called affirmatively furthering fair housing. So affirmatively furthering fair housing says, whereas the main protections are about kind of individual transactions between people. If you're a renter and you're going to rent a house, then the landlord can't say, I don't rent to you because you are, you belong to so-and-so classifications of people. Affirmatively furthering fair housing goes beyond that. It says that if you are a recipient of federal funds through Housing and Urban Development, which was set up to administer the Fair Housing Act, then you have an additional responsibility to use at least a portion of those funds to reduce and eliminate patterns of segregation that already existed, right? So it's not just about not perpetuating new segregation. You also have to show efforts to reduce the segregation that already exists.
I have to ask, Oregon has a long history of housing discrimination. In fact, on your website, there is a document called, it's a panel, I think it is, a set of panels. Marlee, can you tell me about that? It's called Anywhere But Here, which says we really didn't do well with housing with people.
Yeah, our Anywhere But Here display is comprised of panels, and they are pretty tall. And we send them out into the community, and libraries and community spaces are able to then set up those panels, and those panels document the history of housing discrimination and housing progress here in Oregon. So individuals can walk by and read those panels and see pictures of historical documents, and learn about the history of housing discrimination here in Oregon for themselves.
And Sam, we ranked dead last in the country, apparently, for housing equity. Am I right?
Yeah, Oregon used to have the reputation of being the most exclusionary state west of the Mississippi. So there is a long history going all the way back to the foundation of the state that, determined who could live here, where they were allowed to live. We can think about the forced removal of the indigenous or people of Oregon onto reservations. You can very much think of that as kind of a prototype for patterns of segregation that would exist later, right? People based on their race, their national origin, were forced to live in a particular area. And then going beyond that, in Oregon's first constitution, right, it explicitly banned African Americans, slave or free, from settling in Oregon. And that was not removed until the 1920s. Like it was still an active part of the Constitution until 1923. It also had a provision against people of Chinese origin from owning property. That was another aspect of it. We dealt with the forced removal of Japanese Americans during World War II and internment. And then you can consider that a housing issue, right? They were removed from neighborhoods and forced out of the western part of Oregon. And then you can see redlining maps. During the New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation had a redlining map of Portland. Portland at the time was the only Oregon city large enough to get one of those maps, but the dynamics were the same, right? Banks didn't lend to areas with high concentrations of people of color, and that existed well into the 20th century. We also have issues like sundown towns, right? Sundown towns, the idea that people of color could not be out after sunset in a particular jurisdiction. That's not just a Southern issue, right? That was all over Oregon. There are accounts of some sundown towns, especially in Southern Oregon, lasting into the 1960s and 70s. So yeah, we have a long history of these issues that really determined where people could live based on their race or ethnicity or national origin.
Where are we in Oregon's stated goal of welcoming, inclusive, and diverse communities that reflect all Oregonians?
Sure. Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? We have the Fair Housing Act. In fact, Oregon was a bit of a pioneer when it comes to fair housing law. There was a statewide fair housing law that passed in 1959 that protected people on the basis of race, national origin, religion. But at the same time, in practice, there's long been a struggle to enforce those kinds of things. There's always questions about who's responsible for enforcing it.
Well, that's actually a good question to ask you, Marlee. There's breaking news, if you will, on that front about enforcing fair housing law.
Yeah, the Fair Housing Council of Oregon just received a rather large grant from HUD. This grant will enable us to increase our enforcement capabilities. This means sending out testers, conducting more investigations. So expect to see more feet on the ground from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, finishing up 2023 and entering into 2024.
Fill us in here. What does it mean fair housing is your right?
The Fair Housing Act protects everyone existing within the United States who is living here. And everyone is protected because we all belong to a protected class. And we all deserve equal access to housing, to maintaining housing, and to accessing it. So fair housing rights protect individuals at every stage of the housing process, from when they are inquiring about housing, during the application process, during the tenancy and move out. And it also protects people who are looking to buy homes during the process of talking to realtors and banks and insurance companies and lenders. You are protected at every part of the housing process.
I like a quote on your website. It says, fair housing is not an option, it's the law. And that means it has teeth behind it. And you have to take it seriously. You just can't say, oh, that doesn't apply to me as a property owner, manager, or whatever. You have to take it seriously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there is a long record of organizations that maybe thought that they were above fair housing law, and they have come up against the enforcement authority of the Department of Justice, both at the state and federal level. And I'm talking about things like homeowners associations, right? If you touch the housing market, fair housing laws do apply to you.
Well, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
I have been wondering, people might have thoughts when they're trying to rent or buy, and they suddenly think, wait a minute, have I just been discriminated against? It didn't feel right. And they don't know really what to do. And so that's why I'm asking you, what does housing discrimination look like? Marlee.
I think listening to those moments when you feel like maybe something isn't right, maybe I have been treated differently here, paying attention to those red flags are really important. So housing discrimination can look differently depending on what part of housing you're interacting with. So at the point of application, discrimination may look like a housing provider not returning your calls because English is not your first language. It could look like steering you to a certain apartment complex because there's a playground there and you are a family with small kids and more families live at this complex than this complex. It could look like making discriminatory statements, denying people with disabilities access to housing. And then while someone is a tenant, housing discrimination could look like denying reasonable accommodation requests. It could look like making blatantly discriminatory statements, enforcing policies and notices inconsistently, dependent on if that person is a part of a protected class. And it can also look like issuing termination notices and eviction notices inconsistently as well.
So is there something on your website that people can look at, kind of a bulleted list or something of here's what to look for to sort of assess whether or not, yeah, I might need to make a report?
Absolutely. I would say on our website, we have some pre-recorded trainings and free educational materials and guides and resources. If you go to our website, www.fhco.org, and then /resources, it'll take you to that library where you can type in what it is you have a question about, what is the topic, and then some resources will come up related to that.
Is it available in different languages?
Yes, we have some materials available in Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, Russian, and a few others as well.
Well, thank you. All right. So now, how do you report housing discrimination?
Yeah, if you think that you're experiencing discrimination or you would just like to learn more, you can go to our website. Right now, that is the only way to contact us. We are not accepting phone calls at this moment. But if you go to our website, www.fhco.org, at the top of that webpage is a bright red bar that says Report Housing Discrimination Here. You're going to want to click on that bar and then fill out the form. That will connect you to our enforcement team, who then take over instances of intake and investigation and follow-up and advocacy. If you go to the Contact Us tab, there is a hotline available for landlords and housing providers who would like to ask questions and learn about fair housing. We are not going to immediately report you if you are a housing provider and you have a question or a policy that you want to run by us. That hotline is there for you to ask questions, and we want to be a resource for housing providers. And then there's also a option for social service providers to learn more about fair housing and to report discrimination on behalf of their clients.
This sounds like a multi-layered resource for people, and it involves social service agencies, it involves policymakers, it involves government, not just the people who are affected by your decisions here. How do you work with others to combat housing discrimination?
Yeah, I would say on the ground community level, there's so much collaboration happening. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we go into community meetings. We're meeting with social service providers. We're meeting with community groups, religious organizations, tenant groups, and we're talking with folks to teach them about their fair housing rights. I'm of the personal opinion that information on the ground is the most important information you can get out there. Because it's in those conversations where you're talking to your neighbor, you're talking to a friend, and you hear something and you go, actually, I think you have some rights here, and then pointing them in the right direction.
And Sam, you also deal with policymakers and the big picture of where you're going from here. What excites you about maybe breaking through some log jams with the work you do?
Yeah, I mean, we just in very immediate, in a very immediate sense, we've got a lot of breakthroughs happening at the state level. that is very exciting, right? So even though affirmatively furthering fair housing has been a part of fair housing law since 1968, it's been very unclear what that exactly means, right? What is the enforcement power that goes along with that? How is it assessed? And it's been a lot of ups and downs since 1968. So recently, just this year, a new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule was approved by Housing and Urban Development. Technically, at the time of this recording, it's in the comment period, but it will have it will be enforceable by the time that this airs. So that's already a big step, right? So jurisdictions are going to have to do a lot more than they have in the past to analyze what types of segregation and discrimination are happening in their communities and show some concrete actions to do something about it. And then at the state law, we are actually working these principles into the land use processes themselves, right? So as cities and counties are planning to build enough housing for their residents, they're going to have to show how fair housing works into this as well. They're going to have to show that they are introducing new housing opportunity into areas that, for instance, have more access to jobs or are closer to high performing schools, or in the case of Salem has done a great job showing the racial differences in terms of who is exposed to pollution, right? So part of what Salem hopefully will do in their future housing strategies is to actually put housing in areas that are less polluted, and to also have some targeted cleanup efforts to those racially concentrated areas of poverty that are more polluted. So all of these things are eventually working their way into the land use processes themselves. So it's a recognition that these are systemic issues, and it's going to take a systemic solution to solve them.
What came to light and how did it come to light when you just gave us the background that we are now seeing that the city of Salem is fixing problems of environmental problems?
So all recipients of federal funds through Housing and Urban Development are required to periodically do something called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So this is part of their responsibility, and the city of Salem gets to administer its own federal funds through this. And so as part of that, they showed where geographically concentrated areas of disparities in various indices exist. So that's things like access to the job market, things like transportation, access to good schools, and things like exposure to pollution. And if you look at all of these, invariably, the areas that have the highest exposure to pollution, the lowest access to the job market, the worst transportation, all of them are in a very particular area of town, which non-coincidentally is also where the highest concentration of Hispanic or Latino residents live. And the reverse of that is also true, right? So the areas that have the highest exposure to jobs, the best transportation, the lowest exposure to pollution tend to be in the areas of town that have the whitest population. And so by doing this, by doing these analyses, the city is bringing to light things that may not be overtly discriminatory, but show that discrimination, segregation still exists. And it brings to light these problems that they can then address with policies. So that's what affirmatively furthering fair housing is all about.
And the city of Salem has undertaken that with some zeal, I understand.
Yeah, I would say that as far as these required documents, the city of Salem's is one of my personal favorites. They did the best job of really making these problems clear, really just showing on a map what this looks like, what housing segregation and discrimination looks like in the modern day, right? We don't have redlining maps anymore, but we still have these problems, these inequities that are made very clear in these maps.
Marlee, what lessons are to be learned here with governments when it comes to the implementation of the Fair Housing Act?
One thing that I like to point out in trainings is that fair housing law continues to develop and evolve, and the protected classes that we have continue to evolve. So we saw the original 4 in 1968, and then the additions of sex, disability, and familial status. And then even today, states are able to add additional protected classes. Here in Oregon, those additional protected classes are marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and source of income, which means anyone who is using rental assistance, Section 8 vouchers, or other forms of supportive payments such as SSI, SSDI, TANF, they are protected under fair housing from experiencing discrimination. And even within jurisdictions, so within the city of Salem, there are additional protected classes based off of discrimination trends within that area. So in Salem, those additional protected classes are age as well as housing status, referencing one's actual or perceived lack of permanent housing. So taking steps like these, creating those maps, really doing the research to learn what barriers is your community facing, what barriers still exist that aren't immediately coming to mind. Being able to do that research is going to be really helpful in building proactive ways to keep people housed and create more equitable access to housing.
Can you both give me an idea of what you would like to see happen, maybe perhaps wish list dream of how the Fair Housing Act would operate?
Ideally, the addition of more protected classes, immigration status, housing status, veteran status. These are some of the protected classes that are being instituted throughout the United States, and which I think jurisdictionally, statewide, federally could really enhance access for individuals to maintain housing.
Sam?
Yeah, I would completely agree with Marlee. The 2014 introduction of source of income discrimination as a protected class in the state law was, I think, really transformative and potential model for the country. And it could only become stronger by having the backing of that being added as a federal protected class. I think that the enforcement power on that would become much stronger.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting to me that it's 55 years since the Fair Housing Act was passed. Landmark civil rights legislation that was years in the making and is still evolving. And the Fair Housing Council of Oregon is implementing it and helping it do its job, getting better at it. Thank you so much for joining us today on InSight. We've been talking to Marlee Baker and Sam Goldberg of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw.